He sat in his darkened study, a man who could command armies but couldn't control time, looked me in the eye and said, "I need a wife to inherit my empire by tomorrow." Yesterday, my biggest problem was polishing the silver and making sure the floorboards of the Han estate were spotless. I was just the maid, a woman who preferred being invisible while working off a debt that felt like a life sentence. Then the boss, Han Do-kyun, sharply dressed, guarded, and radiating a dangerous urgency, delivered an impossible ultimatum. He said that if he wasn't married within 24 hours, a morality clause in his grandfather's will would strip him of his legacy and hand his empire to a man who would bathe this city in blood. He chose me because I was the only person in his world who didn't fear his shadow. I told him to find someone else, but I didn't know then that his desperation would collide with my family's secrets, turning my quiet life upside down and forcing us both to survive a world that wanted us dead. Do-kyun didn't move. He sat behind the mahogany desk like a statue carved from shadows, his eyes tracking my every breath. I stood by the door, the silver tray in my hands feeling heavier than the leaden silence between us. I had already given him my answer, but in this house, no was a word the walls didn't seem to recognize. "You're a good maid, Licia," he said, his voice a low, melodic grate that sent a shiver down my spine. "Observant, quiet. You notice things others miss. That is why you know I am not asking. I am negotiating." "There is nothing to negotiate, Mr. Han," I replied, keeping my gaze fixed on the space just above his shoulder. "I value my life. Your world is built on high-velocity lead and short lifespans. I want no part of it." He leaned forward, the light from the desk lamp catching the sharp lines of his suit and the exhaustion etched into his face. With a slow, deliberate motion, he slid a thin manila folder across the polished wood. "Your father's gambling debts weren't just to the banks, Licia. He went to the private lenders, the kind who don't send late notices. They send collectors with kerosene and matches." My heart stuttered. I dropped my gaze to the folder. Through the translucent paper, I could see the name of my family's small estate and a series of numbers that made my stomach turn. "The total is 4 million, Do-kyun stated, his tone as cold as a ledger. "The interest doubles at midnight. By tomorrow morning, your parents will be homeless. By next week, they will likely be missing." I felt the air leave the room. The power imbalance I had always been aware of suddenly felt like a physical weight, crushing the breath from my lungs. He wasn't just a boss. He was the only wall standing between my family and a cliff. "You've known this the whole time," I whispered, my composure finally fracturing. "I've known since the day I hired you," he admitted, showing no remorse. "Marry me. Sign the papers, and the debt is erased. I get my grandfather's empire, and you get your family's safety. It's a clean trade." "It's a cage," I countered. "A gilded one," he agreed, sliding a fountain pen toward me. "But it has a lock, and I am the only one with the key. Choose, Alicia. The clock is ticking." I looked at the pen, then at the man who held my life in his hands. I thought of my mother's garden and my father's tired eyes. With trembling fingers, I set the tray down and reached for the pen. The ink felt like blood as I scrawled my name across the contract, tethering my soul to the Mafia boss's empire. The cold air of the estate's private chapel felt like a physical weight against my skin as the clock struck 4 a.m. Outside, the world was silent, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that felt ready to snap. I stood at the altar in my maid's uniform, the white apron a stark, ghostly contrast against the dark mahogany pews. There was no silk, no lace, and no celebration, only the cold efficiency of a business transaction. Beside me, Han Do-kyun stood like a pillar of granite. He hadn't changed out of his dark suit, and the sharp lines of his silhouette projected an authority that seemed to swallow the flickering candlelight. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like a general preparing for a siege. His eyes were fixed forward, ignoring the 3 armed guards at the exits, their hands resting restlessly on their holsters. Between us stood a priest who looked as though he were facing his own execution. His hands shook so violently that the pages of his prayer book rustled like dry leaves in the wind. He kept glancing at the guards, then back at Do-kyun's stony face, his voice barely rising above a terrified whisper as he rushed through the holy rites. He wasn't blessing a union, he was witnessing a hostage situation disguised as a sacrament. "Do you, Han Do-kyun, take this woman?" the priest stammered, his eyes darting toward the heavy doors. "I do," Do-kyun interrupted, his voice cutting through the priest's hesitation like a blade. There was no warmth in the words, only the grim satisfaction of a man securing his borders. When it was my turn, the silence stretched. I looked at the priest's sweating brow and then at the guards who represented the violent world I was now officially entering. I thought of the manila folder on Do-kyun's desk and the $4 million that bought my silence. "I do," I whispered, the ink tasting like ash. The priest didn't wait for a kiss. He barely waited for the signatures before he was scurrying away into the shadows of the sacristy. Do-kyun didn't look at me as he tucked the marriage certificate into his breast pocket, the final piece of armor he needed to protect his empire. As we walked out of the chapel, the first hints of a gray dawn were breaking over the horizon, marking the beginning of the most dangerous day of my life. The transition from the shadow of the chapel to the blinding opulence of the master suite happened with a speed that left me breathless. I was no longer Leisha, the girl who moved unnoticed through the hallways. I was being sculpted into a weapon of high society. A team of stylists, brought in under the cover of darkness, stripped away my starched uniform and replaced it with a gown of midnight blue silk that felt like liquid moonlight against my skin. They draped diamonds around my throat, cold, heavy stones that felt more like a collar than jewelry. Do-kyun stood by the window, watching the transformation with a clinical eye. He didn't offer a compliment, he only adjusted the sit of his own blazer and checked his watch. "The executors are here," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register. "They aren't looking for a wife, they are looking for a lie. Give them nothing but the truth I've paid for." As we descended the grand staircase, I felt the shift in the house. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the sharp, metallic tang of hidden weapons. In the sun-drenched dining room, 3 men sat waiting, the guardians of the Han legacy. They were old, their eyes narrowed with a lifetime of suspicion, looking at me as if I were a smudge on a pristine canvas. "A sudden match, Do-kyun," one of them remarked, his voice like dry parchment. He turned his piercing gaze toward me. "And where did a woman of such refined taste come from?" The table was a minefield of crystal and silver. I felt the familiar urge to reach for a fallen napkin or clear a plate, the muscle memory of a servant tugging at my heart. But I caught Do-kyun's gaze. His hand moved under the table, his fingers grazing mine. It wasn't a gesture of affection, it was a tether, a reminder of the $4 million ghost standing behind my chair. "I've spent my life in the shadows of this estate," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I met the executor's eyes, mirroring the cold composure I had watched Do-kyun use for years. It's only natural that I eventually stepped into the light. The meal was a blur of high-stakes interrogation masked as polite conversation. Every time my composure wavered, I felt the weight of the diamonds, a reminder that in this world, beauty was merely a different kind of armor. By the time the coffee was served, the executor's suspicion had begun to settle into a grudging acceptance. We had survived the first hour, but as Do-kyun's grip tightened on my hand, I realized that playing the part of the matriarch was going to be far more exhausting than being the maid. The afternoon sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate, casting long, predatory shadows across the marble floors. The executors had left, but the air remained thick with the scent of old money and new threats. I retreated to the library, the silk of my gown rustling against the silence. But the weight of the diamonds still pulled at my neck like a leash. I was no longer the one cleaning the dust. I was the one trapped in the display case. A soft click of a door made me turn. Standing in the threshold was Park John-gi, Dak Yun's second in command. He was a man of sharp angles and a smile that never reached his eyes that were currently dissecting me with the precision of a surgeon. He had been with the organization for a decade, and he looked at the throne with the hunger of a man who had been promised a kingdom only to see it snatched away by a maid in blue silk. "A remarkable transformation, Lesia," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with a feigned warmth that made my skin crawl. Though I find myself wondering how a woman who was scrubbed the floors yesterday suddenly learned to dance so gracefully through a legal minefield. "Necessity is a fast teacher, Mr. Park," I replied, folding my hands in my lap. I kept my posture composed, drawing on years of practice staying invisible, though now I was forced to be seen. "Is it necessity, or is it a performance?" He stepped closer, leaning against a bookshelf. "I've noticed the staff is whispering. Maria in the kitchen says you still try to clear your own plate. Thomas in the garden noted that you and our beloved boss haven't spent more than 5 minutes alone since the ceremony. It's a very quiet honeymoon." I felt a cold prickle of alarm. John-gi wasn't just watching us. He had turned my former coworkers, people I had shared tea and grievances with, into his eyes and ears. Every slip, every habit of my old life was being documented as evidence of a fraud. "Dak Yun is a busy man," I said, my voice hardening. "He doesn't need to perform for the staff, and neither do I." John-gi's smile widened, revealing a row of teeth that looked too sharp. "Of course, but the inheritance executors are fickle. If they hear so much as a rumor that this union is a contract and not a romance, the empire crumbles, and I'm very good at listening to rumors." He left without another word, leaving the threat hanging in the stagnant air. I looked toward the security cameras tucked into the corners of the ceiling, wondering which of my friends was watching me right now, waiting for me to fail. I wasn't just fighting for an empire anymore. I was living in a house full of ghosts, and every one of them was on John-gi's payroll. The gala was a sea of glittering masks and sharpened knives, a celebration of power that felt more like a funeral. I walked beside Dak Yun, my hand resting on the heavy wool of his sleeve, feeling the frantic pulse in my own wrist. The room was a labyrinth of potential enemies, and John-gi's watchful eyes seemed to follow us through every camera lens and champagne flute. The first shot didn't sound like a gun. It was a sharp, crystalline snap that shattered the ice sculpture at the center of the ballroom. Then came the scream. Before I could process the sound, Do-kyun's weight slammed into me, forcing me toward the floor. He didn't cry out, but as we hit the marble, I felt a sudden, terrifying heat spread across my silk gown. The blue fabric was turning a dark, wet black. "Move," he hissed, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a desperate focus. We scrambled behind a heavy velvet curtain as the room dissolved into chaos, shouting, the rhythmic thud of suppressed gunfire, and the heavy boots of his guards rushing the perimeter. In the dim light of the alcove, I saw the jagged tear in his shoulder. He tried to reach for his weapon, but his hand fumbled, his strength leaking out onto the floor. In that moment, the matriarch vanished, and the maid took over. I didn't panic. I didn't have the luxury. My mind snapped into the cold, clinical efficiency of years spent managing a household under pressure. I reached for the hem of my midnight blue silk gown and ripped it upward, the expensive fabric shrieking as it tore. "Hold still," I commanded, my voice surer than it had been since the wedding. I used the diamonds at my throat to weigh down the pressure point, wrapping the silk strips tight around his shoulder with a precision that comes from 1,000 mended linens and bandaged scrapes. He looked at me then, really looked at me, not as a contract or a shield, but as a person. His teeth were gritted against the pain, but his hand reached out, gripping my forearm with a strength that felt like an anchor. "You're not just a maid, Licia," he whispered, his breath shallow. "I'm the woman who's going to keep you alive long enough to inherit this mess," I replied, pulling the knot tight. The sound of the guards approaching signaled that the immediate threat was over, but as I sat there in the dark, my hands stained with the blood of the man I had married for a debt, the distance between us finally collapsed. I wasn't just working for him anymore, I was fighting with him. The safe house was a fortress of glass and cold steel, tucked away from the prying eyes of the city and the treachery of the main estate. In the sterile silence of the master bedroom, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a clock that felt like a countdown to our next disaster. Do-kyun sat on the edge of the bed, his shirt discarded, revealing the bandage I had tied with such desperate precision. The midnight blue silk of my gown, now stained and ruined, lay in a heap on the floor, a discarded skin of a life I never asked for. I moved toward him with a basin of warm water, my movements quiet and deliberate. As I began to clean the dried blood from his skin, I expected the usual wall of silence, the cold armor of the boss who commanded thousands. But as the damp cloth touched his shoulder, I felt a tremor run through him that had nothing to do with the cold. "I never wanted the crown, Licia," he whispered, his voice so low I almost missed it. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on his hands, which were scarred and calloused, far from the polished image he projected to the world. "My grandfather built this empire on a foundation of bones. He made sure that by the time I was old enough to understand the cost, I was too deep in blood to ever climb out." I paused, the cloth hovering over his skin. For the first time, I didn't see the Mafia boss who had leveraged my family's ruin. I saw a man who was as much a prisoner of his name as I was of my debt. "You speak as if you have no choice," I said softly, continuing my work. "Choice is a luxury for people who don't have targets on their backs," he countered, finally looking up. The exhaustion in his eyes was staggering, a weight of decades spent looking over his shoulder, wondering which friend would be the one to slide the knife home. "If I fail tomorrow, if the empire falls to John D., the streets will burn. He doesn't want to lead, he wants to consume. I stay on the throne so he can't." The morality clause in the will wasn't a test of his character. It was a desperate attempt by a dying man to tether a monster to something human, and I was that tether. "They call me a monster," he continued, his voice cracking just enough for me to see the man behind the myth. "And perhaps I am. But even monsters get tired of the dark." I reached out, my fingers grazing his cheek. It was the first time I had touched him without a contract or a bandage between us. In the quiet of the night, the power imbalance that had defined us felt fragile, replaced by a shared, heavy understanding. We were both trapped in a gilded cage, and for the first time I realized that I didn't want to see him face the darkness alone. The fragile piece of the safe house shattered at 2 a.m., not with a bang, but with the hiss of gas creeping through the vents. I woke to the sound of a struggle in the hallway, the muffled thud of a body hitting the floor, and the distinctive metallic click of a weapon being readied. Before I could scream, a gloved hand clamped over my mouth, and the world dissolved into a blur of shadows and the stinging scent of chemicals. When I regained consciousness, the air was cold and smelled of salt and rotting wood. I was no longer in the master suite. I was bound to a rusted chair in a warehouse that felt like the edge of the world. The diamonds around my neck were gone, but the weight of my new reality was heavier than any stone. "You look much more like yourself in the dark, Licia," a voice sneered. Park Jin-gi stepped into the harsh circle of a single overhead light. He held a phone in his hand, its screen glowing like a malevolent eye. He wasn't hiding anymore. The facade of the loyal second-in-command had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who had waited too long for a throne he felt he had earned in blood. "I've sent the ultimatum," Jun-gi said, pacing the concrete floor. A live stream of this room is currently playing on Do-kyun's private monitor. He has exactly 1 hour to sign the resignation papers and wire the offshore holdings to my account. If he doesn't, the morality clause won't matter because he won't have a wife to inherit anything. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. Do you think he'll do it? Do you think a man who has killed for power will give it all away for a maid he met a few days ago? I looked at the camera lens, imagining Do-kyun on the other side. I thought of the man I had bandaged in the dark, the one who admitted he was tired of the shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my gaze to remain steady. He won't do it for the maid, I whispered, my voice raspy. He'll do it because he finally found something worth more than your blood-soaked empire. Joon-gi laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. We'll see. In 40 minutes, we find out exactly what Han Do-kyun's soul is worth. The phone in his hand chimed, a notification that the boss had logged on. The game was no longer about inheritance or debts. It was a countdown to a choice that would either destroy the empire or save us both. The roar of a single engine cut through the salt-heavy air, announcing Do-kyun's arrival at the pier. He didn't come with a fleet of black SUVs or an army of soldiers. He stepped into the sickly yellow light of the warehouse alone, his long coat fluttering in the wind, a single leather briefcase in his hand. He looked small against the vast industrial backdrop of the docks, yet the sheer gravity of his presence made Joon-gi's men shift their grip on their weapons. The papers are signed, Do-kyun said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the cavernous space. He didn't look at Joon-gi. His eyes were locked on mine, burning with a fierce, quiet intensity that told me everything the contract hadn't. The holdings are transferred. Let her go. Joon-gi stepped forward, a triumphant sneer twisting his features. The great Han Do-kyun, trading a kingdom for a maid. My grandfather would have spat on your grave. He gestured to one of his men. Verify the transfer. As the guard moved toward the briefcase, I saw the slight tension in Do-kyun's jaw, the telltale sign of a man who had one card left to play, but needed a window to throw it. I knew then that he hadn't come here just to surrender. He had come to give me a chance to fight back. I looked at the heavy, rusted bolt securing my chair to the floor. During the hours of my captivity, I hadn't just been waiting. I had been working the loose wood of the armrest, using the maid's efficiency that had defined my life. With a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline, I slammed my weight sideways. The wood splintered with a deafening crack, and I threw the heavy chair directly into the path of the guard reaching for the briefcase. Now, I screamed. The distraction was a heartbeat, but a heartbeat was all Do-kyun needed. He moved with a predatory grace, a hidden subcompact weapon appearing in his hand as if by magic. The warehouse erupted into a symphony of gunfire and shattered glass. In the chaos, I didn't cower. I rolled toward the shadows, grabbing a discarded metal pipe from the floor. When Joon-gi turned to fire at Do-kyun, I didn't hesitate. I swung with every ounce of resentment I held for the men who thought they could own me. The blow caught him across the knees, sending him crashing to the concrete. Do-kyun was over him in seconds, the barrel of his gun pressed against Joon-gi's temple, but he didn't pull the trigger. He looked at me, breathing hard, the empire already gone, but something far more valuable standing in its place. "You're late for your shift," he joked, his voice ragged and thick with relief. "I'm off the clock," I replied, dropping the pipe and walking into the light to meet him. The tall windows of the Han estate no longer felt like the bars of a gilded cage. A year had passed since the night at the docks, and the heavy scent of gunpowder and old secrets had been replaced by the crisp fragrance of fresh lilies and expensive ink. The empire still stood, but its foundation had been scrubbed clean. Do-kyun had systematically dismantled the shadow operations, turning the blood-soaked business into a legitimate titan of shipping and logistics, a world where the only wars were fought in boardrooms rather than back alleys. I stood in the center of the grand study, wearing a dress of soft ivory that flowed like water, a far cry from the starched black and white uniform I once wore as a maid. I wasn't just his wife on a piece of paper anymore. I was his partner in every sense. I was the one who reviewed contracts, the one who navigated the political minefields, and the one whose word was as final as his. Joon-gi was a ghost of the past, and the household staff now looked to me not for chores, but for direction. Do-kyun entered the room, the sharp lines of his suit still projecting an effortless authority, but the guarded, weary expression he had carried for decades had finally softened. He walked toward me, his eyes fixed on mine with a warmth that once seemed impossible for a man of his stature. He didn't look like a boss, he looked like a man who had finally found peace. "The last of the old debts have been settled," he said, his voice a low, steady hum that no longer sent chills of fear, but of comfort. "Your family's land is secure, and the empire is truly ours now, not my grandfather's and certainly not the state's." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band, devoid of the heavy, cold diamonds that had once felt like a collar. "Happy anniversary, Lisha." He slid the ring onto my finger. "A year ago, I needed a wife to keep my empire. Today, I realized the empire was just a way to find you." I leaned into him, the power imbalance that defined our first meeting long since dissolved into a shared, quiet strength. We had both been prisoners of our circumstances, but together we had built a new reign, one defined by choice rather than necessity. The maid and the Mafia boss were gone. In their place were two people who had survived the dark and decided to build a life in the light.